The Ainsworth diamonds were a lie. They felt like one against Eleanora's skin, a cold declaration of a status she held in name only. As Duchess of Ainsworth, she was the highest-ranking woman in the room, a fact that was technically indisputable and emotionally meaningless. The necklace, a river of light, settled into the hollow of her throat, each stone a reminder of a ducal line she had married into, but never truly joined. The weight was not in the carats, but in the history of women who had worn them before her, presumably beloved, or at least respected, by their husbands. From her position at the top of the grand staircase, she could see the entire ballroom laid out below. It was a masterpiece of Ainsworth power. Gilded ceilings, air thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and beeswax. A string quartet playing something unobtrusive and elegant. And in the very center of it all, holding court as if it were his right, was her husband, Alastair, the Duke. He was not alone. He was never alone anymore. At his side, her hand resting on his arm with an intimacy that was both brazen and utterly confident, was Isabella de Courcy. Her gown was the color of champagne, a shade just daring enough to draw the eye, her laughter a bright, musical sound designed to be overheard. She was beautiful, of course. That was the first and last thing anyone ever said about her. The assembled guests of the temps performed a delicate dance of awareness and ignorance. They saw, they noted, they whispered behind their fans, but their faces remained placid. The Duke's affair was a known fact, a piece of social currency, but to see it displayed so openly, in his own home, with his wife in residence, that was a new, sharper transgression. Eleanora took a breath. Her gloved hands rested on the marble balustrade. She could have stayed up here. She could have retreated to her rooms, pleaded a headache, and allowed the whispers to follow her. It was what everyone expected. It was what a sensible, wounded wife would do. But her pain was a private country, its borders closed to all travelers. She would not perform it for them. She began to descend the stairs. One step, then another. The rustle of her silver-grey silk gown was the only sound that seemed to belong to her. Every eye in the room, which had been so carefully avoiding the Duchess's empty place, now fixed upon her. A slow, collective intake of breath seemed to pull the air from the room. The quartet faltered for a half-beat before resuming their tune. Alastair saw her. His smile, which had been directed at something witty Mr. Courcy had said, froze. A flicker of something, annoyance, apprehension, crossed his features before being locked down behind a mask of aristocratic indifference. He did not move from his mistress's side. He did not offer a hand. He simply watched his wife approach, a silent, silver-grey ship sailing into the heart of his carefully constructed storm. Eleanora's path was direct. She did not look at the faces that turned to track her progress. She did not acknowledge the sudden, profound hush that was falling, snuffing out the low murmur of conversation, piece by piece. Her world had narrowed to the small tableau in the center of the room, her husband and the woman who held his arm. She stopped a respectable 2 paces before them. The silence was now absolute. The quartet had given up entirely, their bows hovering over their strings. It was a silence so deep, it felt like a physical pressure, a vacuum waiting to be filled with the explosion everyone anticipated. A scene, tears, a demand, an accusation. Eleanora looked not at her husband, but directly at Isabella de Courcy. She saw the woman's momentary triumph curdle into confusion, then alarm. Mr. Courcy's hand tightened on the Duke's arm, and then, With a grace that was both innate and exquisitely practiced, Eleanora, Duchess of Ainsworth, sank into a curtsy. It was not a shallow dip of the head. It was a full, formal curtsy, the kind one offered to royalty. The silk of her gown whispered as it pooled on the polished floor. Her head was bowed, her gaze lowered. She held the position for a single, impossibly long heartbeat. In that silence, 1,000 things happened. A woman gasped, a sound quickly stifled. An elderly lord dropped his quizzing glass. But most of all, there was a seismic shift in the room's understanding. This was not weakness. This was not surrender. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the chilling precision of a blade. "You have taken my place," the gesture said, "so you shall have the honors that go with it." It was an abdication and an accusation in one flawless movement. When she rose, her expression was serene, composed. She had transferred the entire weight of the social transgression from herself to them. She had made their private arrangement a public institution, and in doing so had highlighted its utter impropriety. She finally met her husband's eyes. The shock in them was stark, unmasked. He looked at her as if he had never seen her before, and perhaps he hadn't. Without a word, Eleanora turned. She did not flee. She walked at that same measured pace back through the parted sea of guests, up the grand staircase, and disappeared from view. Behind her, the silence held for another 10 seconds, stretched taut and thin. Then, the whispers began. No longer furtive, but sharp, shocked, and universal. The entire ballroom had gone silent, and when the sound returned, the world had changed. Alistair stood frozen, Mr. Corsi's hand suddenly feeling like a brand on his arm, and stared at the empty space where his wife had been. The heavy oak door to her apartments closed with a quiet click, a sound of finality. Eleanora did not lean against it. She walked to the center of the sitting room, her spine as straight as it had been on the staircase. The silence here was different. It was her own. She stood for a long moment, listening to the faint, muffled echo of the music resuming downstairs, a desperate attempt to stitch the evening back together. It would not work. The tear was too clean, too deep. Her fingers went to the clasp of the Ainsworth diamonds. The mechanism was intricate, designed to be operated by a lady's maid, but she knew its secret. A small, firm pressure, a slight twist. The river of light came free. She held it in her hands, the stones shockingly cold now, inert. They were just minerals, dug from the earth. Their power was conferred, an illusion she had participated in for 5 years. She laid the necklace on its velvet bed, inside a heavy leather box, closing the lid with a soft thud. Then the earrings, the bracelets. One by one, the symbols of her station were put away. When she was done, she wore only her silver-grey gown, unadorned. She felt lighter. A soft knock came at the door connecting her rooms to the main hallway. "Your Grace?" It was Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, a woman who had been at Ainsworth Manor since Alistair was a boy, her face a roadmap of loyal service. "Enter, Mrs. Davies." The older woman came in, carrying a small tray. On it was a single cup of chamomile tea, fragrant steam rising in the cool air. She set it on the table beside Eleanora's reading chair. She did not mention the ball. She did not offer condolences or ask questions. Her gaze was steady, full of a quiet, seeing sympathy that was worth more than 1,000 words of pity. "I thought you might have a chill, Your Grace," she said, her voice low. "The North Corridor is always drafty this time of year." It was a fiction, and they both knew it. Eleonora had not come via the North Corridor. But it was the offered fiction that mattered. A small, sturdy bridge over an abyss of things that could not be said. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies. That is very thoughtful." The housekeeper smoothed her apron, a nervous gesture Eleonora had never seen from her before. "Will you be requiring anything else?" Eleonora looked at the woman who had shown her more consistent, quiet kindness than anyone else in this house. "No, that will be all." Mrs. Davis curtsied, a small, respectful dip that was the exact opposite of the one Eleonora had performed downstairs. It was genuine. It was for her, not her title. As she turned to leave, Eleonora spoke again. "Mrs. Davis." The housekeeper paused at the door. "The fires in the estate office. Would you have them laid in the morning, please? I intend to work there tomorrow." A flicker of understanding, of profound approval, crossed the older woman's face. The Duchess was not retiring to her bed with lavender water and grief. She was going to work. "Of course, Your Grace. First thing." The door closed, and Eleonora was alone again. She drank the tea. It was warm, soothing. It did not fix anything, but it was something real in a world of performance. The next morning, while London society was still dissecting every nuance of the Duchess's unprecedented act, Eleonora was not in her grand, lonely bedchamber. She was in a room on the ground floor that had once been a steward's office and had, through neglect, become a repository for forgotten furniture and out-of-date maps. She had claimed it a year ago. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the faint, clean scent of the morning's fire. Sunlight, pale and autumnal, streamed through the tall, unwashed windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. On the large mahogany desk, there was not a single piece of personal correspondence. There were ledgers. There were letters from tenant farmers. There was a detailed, hand-drawn map of the Penwood farmland, one of the Duke's most distant and least profitable holdings. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. Her handwriting was clear, precise, without ornamentation. She was making notes in the margins of a report from the local bailiff, a man whose prose was as muddy as the fields he described. Yields down 15%. Tenant complaints re-drainage. Suggests rent deferral. Eleonora drew a thin, straight line under the word drainage. She had been studying the problem for months. The issue wasn't the tenants, and it wasn't the rent. It was the land itself, exhausted and waterlogged. Deferring rent was a plaster on a wound that required surgery. She opened another book, a heavy tome bound in cracking leather. It was a survey of the estate from 1780. Her fingers, free of rings, traced the old maps, the forgotten watercourses, the notes on soil composition. Here, in this quiet, dusty room, she was not the overlooked wife. She was not a symbol of a broken marriage. She was a mind at work. The numbers made sense. The land had its own logic. Unlike the world of the ballroom, this was a world she could understand, and perhaps a world she could mend. The Ainsworth diamonds lay in their box upstairs, but the true Ainsworth inheritance, its land and its people, was here, spread across her desk, and it was in trouble. Alistair woke with the flat, metallic taste of too much brandy in his mouth and the memory of the silence. It was the silence he couldn't escape, the silence that had followed Eleonora's curtsy, a ringing void that had exposed him utterly. He had spent the remainder of the night in his study, long after the last guest had departed, long after Isabella had been sent home in a carriage, her nervous chatter grating on his raw nerves. He had replayed the moment 100 times. The way Eleanora had moved, the impossible calm in her eyes. It was not the act of a jealous wife. A jealous wife would have screamed, or wept, or thrown a glass of wine. It was the act of a queen abdicating a throne she no longer found worthy of her reign. The insult was so profound, so elegantly delivered, that he still felt the sting of it. She had not attacked Isabella. She had dismissed her, and him along with her, as a settled matter of state. He rang for his valet, his movements sharp and angry. As he was being dressed, his mind raced. What had he expected? He had been careless, arrogant, flaunting his arrangement with Isabella under his own roof. He had assumed Eleanora would do what she always did: retreat, become invisible, absorb the slight with that quiet, maddening dignity of hers. He had mistaken her restraint for weakness. He saw that now. He had prodded a creature he did not understand, and it had responded in a way he could never have predicted. Later that morning, a note arrived. Isabella's handwriting, a florid, emotional scrawl. My dearest, I cannot stop thinking of last night. The audacity! The woman must be mad. You must set things right. Everyone is talking. They pity you, being shackled to such a strange, cold creature. He crumpled the note and tossed it into the fire. Pity him? No one was pitying him. They were laughing at him. The Duke of Ainsworth, publicly neutered by his own Duchess, who had not raised her voice. The coldness she spoke of. He had once thought it a failing in Eleanora. Now, for the first time, it seemed like a fortress, one he had never been permitted to enter. His man of business, Mr. Crow, was announced. A portly man with a perpetually worried expression, Crow entered the study, wringing his hands. Your Grace, I am sorry to intrude so early. What is it, Crow? Alistair asked, his tone clipped. It is the accounts, Your Grace. The quarterly reports. They are concerning. Crow laid a sheaf of papers on the desk. Specifically, the Penwood estate. The revenues have collapsed. The tenants are on the verge of revolt. They say the land is soured. If we don't invest, and heavily, we will get nothing from it next year. Frankly, my recommendation is to sell it. Alistair stiffened. Sell Penwood? It is a drain, Your Grace, and with the loan from Barings due for renegotiation in 2 months, our position is not as strong as it should be. Sell Penwood? The land had been part of his mother's dowry. He remembered picnics there as a boy, his mother laughing as she pointed out different birds in the hedgerows. It was one of the few, uncomplicatedly happy memories he possessed. No, he said, the word flat and final. We are not selling Penwood. But, Your Grace, the capital required to make it profitable again. Find another way, Alistair cut him off. Examine the household expenditures, find economies, but Penwood is not for sale. Crow bowed, his expression even more worried than before. As you wish, Your Grace. When the man had gone, Alistair stood staring out the window at the grey London sky. A financial crisis on top of a social one. He felt beset on all sides. He thought of Eleanora's calm face. While he had been preening in ballrooms, his inheritance was crumbling. He had been playing the part of the Duke, while his Duchess, it seemed, was the only one minding the duchy. The thought was unwelcome, and he pushed it away. He would handle it. He always handled everything. But the memory of the silence, and the woman who had created it, lingered like a ghost in the room. The weeks that followed the ball bled into a damp, melancholic autumn. The London season shuttered its windows, and the ton retreated to their country estates to hunt, gossip, and wait for the mud to freeze. At Ainsworth House, a chill had set in that had little to do with the weather. Alastair was rarely seen. He was brusque with the staff, closeted for long hours with Mr. Crow, and his break with Isabella de Courcy was spoken of as a fait accompli, a casualty of the Duchess's silent coup. Eleonora, for her part, maintained her routine. She took her meals in her rooms, presided over the household accounts with Mrs. Davis each Friday, and spent the majority of her days in the estate office. The room became her sanctuary. The scent of drying ink and old paper was a comfort. The logic of numbers was a balm. She had opened a correspondence with a Mr. Finch, the Ainsworth family's retired archivist, who lived in a small cottage in Bath. He was old, and his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his mind was a razor. "Your Grace," he wrote, his script shaky but clear. "You are correct to question the current crop rotation at Penwood. The fourth Duke, your husband's great-grandfather, experimented with a 7-year cycle, including 2 years of clover to replenish the soil. The records are in the lower archive, box 7B, if they have not been eaten by mice." She found the box. It was covered in a century of dust, the records inside fragile and smelling of decay. But they were there. She spent days transcribing the relevant passages, comparing the old surveys to her modern maps, her mind wholly absorbed. One crisp October afternoon, she did something she had not done in years. She ordered a simple, unadorned carriage, and, with only a single footman for propriety, she travelled the 2 hours to the Penwood lands. She did not go to the bailiff's house. Instead, she had the carriage stop at the edge of a field, and she got out. The air was sharp, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. The field before her was exactly as the reports described. Fallow, studded with puddles of standing water, the soil dark and heavy. She walked the perimeter, her sensible boots sinking slightly into the mud. She crumbled a clod of earth in her gloved hand. It was dense, airless. A man was mending a fence nearby, a tenant farmer named John Miller. He watched her approach, his expression wary. He recognized the ducal livery on the carriage. He removed his cap, expecting a lecture about rents. "Good afternoon," Eleonora said, her voice calm. "Your Grace," he mumbled, surprised. He had never seen the Duchess here. He had never seen the Duke here either, for that matter. She gestured to the field. "The water doesn't drain." It wasn't a question. The farmer's caution gave way to a flicker of interest. "No, Your Grace. Hasn't for years. Sours the ground. We call it the Sorrow Field." "In the old surveys," Eleonora said, looking not at him, but at the lay of the land, "there was a ditch running along that hedgerow. It fed into the Penwood stream. It seems to have been filled in." Miller stared at her. "My grandfather used to talk of that. Said it was filled in during the enclosures, 80 years back. No one's thought of it since." "If it were redug," she mused, almost to herself, "and if we were to lay drainage tiles across the lower half of the field, and plant it with clover for 2 seasons. She trailed off, her mind working through the calculations. The farmer's suspicion had vanished, replaced by astonishment. He was speaking not to a remote aristocrat, but to someone who understood the land. Someone who saw the problem not as a matter of failed tenants, but of a failed system. "It would take a deal of work, Your Grace," he said, a note of hope creeping into his voice for the first time. "A deal of money." "I know," she said softly. She met his gaze. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Miller." She walked back to her carriage, leaving the farmer staring after her, a strange new idea taking root in his mind. He had been witnessed. The land had been witnessed. For the first time in a very long time, it felt as though someone was actually looking. As the carriage pulled away, Eleonora made a new note in her journal, a firm, decisive stroke of the pen. The visit had confirmed her theory. The path forward was clear, even if the means were not yet within her grasp. She was building her case, one fact at a time, in the quiet certainty of her own competence. And now, gentle viewers, we must take a short pause. Perhaps you are listening from a cozy chair by the fire, or on a long journey of your own. Wherever you are, I thank you for your time and attention. These stories of quiet hearts and slow-burning change are a passion of mine, and sharing them with you is a privilege. If you are enjoying our journey with the Duchess, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe, or perhaps leave a comment to let us know where in the world you are listening from. It brings this narrator great joy to imagine you all. Now, let us return to Ainsworth House, where a crisis is about to force a duke to look where he has long refused to see. The letter from Baring's Bank arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered on a silver tray to Alastair's study, and its contents were as cold and hard as the metal it lay on. The bank was not inclined to extend the Duke's credit under the current terms. They cited falling revenues from his agricultural holdings and the general uncertainty of the market. They required a substantial capital payment to secure the new loan, a sum Alastair knew, with a sinking feeling, that he did not have. Mr. Crow, when summoned, was pale and sweating. "I warned you, Your Grace. Penwood is an anchor dragging us down. Without it, our portfolio is strong. With it, the bankers are nervous." "It is not just Penwood," Alastair snapped, pacing the room. "You told me to find economies. What have you found?" "I have trimmed the household budget where I can, Your Grace. Reduced the wine order. Cancelled the purchase of the 2 new hunters. But these are droplets in an ocean. The sums the bank requires are significant." Crow wrung his hands. "My advice remains the same. Sell the land." "No." The word was a rock. Selling Penwood would be a public admission of failure. It would be a betrayal of his mother's memory. It was unthinkable. There must be another way. There must be something in the archives, old deeds, forgotten assets. "The archives are a disaster, Your Grace. A century of neglect. It would take a team of clerks a year to make sense of them." After dismissing the despairing Crow, Alastair was left alone with the letter. The bank's deadline was a guillotine. For the first time in his life, he felt the true, crushing weight of his responsibilities, and he felt utterly unequal to them. The title, the wealth, the power, it was all a facade if he could not command the respect of his own bankers. That night, sleep would not come. The problem churned in his mind. He found himself wandering the silent, sleeping house, a ghost in his own domain. He walked past Eleonora's apartments. A thin line of light shone from beneath her door. It was well past 2 in the morning. What was she doing? Reading? Writing letters? He had no idea what she did with her time. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had lived with this woman for 5 years and knew less about her daily life than he did about his least known tenant. An idea, born of desperation, took hold. The estate office. She worked there. Crow said the archives were a disaster, but she was always in that office. Drawn by an impulse he didn't bother to analyze, he made his way to the ground floor. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. A single lamp was burning low on the desk, casting long shadows. The room was empty, but it was not the chaotic mess he had imagined. It was ordered, meticulous. Books were stacked neatly. Papers were filed in labeled portfolios. On the wall hung the large map of the Penwood lands, but it was covered in fine, faint pencil marks, annotations, and calculations. He walked to the desk. It was dominated by a large, open ledger. He looked down, and the first thing he saw was her handwriting. It was nothing like her social correspondence, which had a formal, distant elegance. This was different. It was the hand of a scholar, a strategist. It was clear, sharp, decisive. The page was a comparative analysis of the Penwood yields, year by year, cross-referenced with rainfall and commodity prices. In the margins were notes. Bailiff's report attributes decline to tenant laziness. Data does not support this. Note consistent flooding in fields 4 and 5 post-1785. Correlates with enclosure map, filling of eastern drainage ditch. He felt a strange jolt, as if the world had tilted on its axis. He picked up a slim portfolio next to the ledger. Its label read, Penwood Restoration Proposal. He opened it. Inside were not vague ideas, but a complete, costed plan. There were copies of her correspondence with the retired archivist, Mr. Finch. There were geological survey maps from decades ago. There was a detailed proposal for redigging the old drainage ditch and laying new ceramic tiles, with cost estimates sourced from 3 different contractors. There was a multi-year planting schedule, starting with 2 years of nitrogen-fixing clover, followed by a rotation of wheat and barley. There were projections, pages of them, showing the initial capital outlay amortized over 10 years, with the estate showing a projected profit by year 4 and a 20% increase in revenue by year 7. It was brilliant. It was thorough. It was the work of a master strategist. Alistair sank into the chair, the portfolio in his hands. He read every page. He checked the math. He cross-referenced her notes with the old ledgers she had stacked nearby. He did not find a single error. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale grey light into the room when he finally looked up. He had been there all night, and in the course of that night, his entire understanding of his wife, his marriage, and his own catastrophic negligence had been dismantled and rebuilt. She had not been retreating. She had not been hiding. She had been working. She had been quietly, diligently, and single-handedly trying to save the very estate he was about to lose through pride and ignorance. The woman he had dismissed as a cold, ornamental fixture in his life possessed a mind that outstripped his own and that of his man of business by a country mile. He looked at the empty chair opposite the desk, the indentation in the cushion still visible. He imagined her sitting there, night after night, in this dusty room, solving his problems while he entertained his mistress in the next. The shame was so acute it was a physical pain, a burning in his chest that had nothing to do with brandy. The curtsy at the ball had been a single, stunning blow. This was different. This was the revelation of 1,000 unseen betrayals, a debt so large he could not imagine how it might ever be repaid. The next morning, Alistair did not summon Eleonora. He sent a footman with a note, a simple, formal request. I would be grateful if you would meet me in the library at 11 o'clock to discuss an estate matter. He chose the library deliberately. It was not his study, the seat of his authority. It was not her sitting room, the heart of her private domain. The library was neutral ground, a room dedicated to knowledge. It felt to him like the only appropriate place for the conversation he needed to have. When she entered, precisely at 11, he was standing by the fireplace, the Penwood portfolio in his hand. She was dressed simply, in a dark blue day dress. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She gave a small, correct nod of her head. "You wished to see me, Your Grace." The title, which he had always used, suddenly sounded like a reprimand. He had insisted on formality between them from the very beginning. Now it felt like a wall of his own making. "Eleonora," he began, and then stopped. He had intended to apologize, to explain, but the words felt cheap, inadequate. They were the end of a story, not the beginning. He had to start somewhere else. He had to start with the work. He held up the portfolio. "I found this in the estate office." She showed no surprise, no defensiveness. "I see." "I read it," he said. "All of it." He gestured to a chair. "Please." She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He remained standing, the portfolio feeling heavy in his hand. The power dynamic in the room was inverted. He was the supplicant. "Your proposal for the Penwood drainage," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. "How did you calculate the cost of the ceramic tiles?" The quote from the Telford works seems remarkably low. Her gaze sharpened, a flicker of the focused intelligence he had seen in her handwriting. "I corresponded with them directly," she said. "They have a new type of kiln that has reduced their production costs. They have not yet advertised the new price list. I also bundled the order with the tiles required for the roof repairs at the home farm, securing a larger discount." He nodded slowly. Of course she had. "And the labor costs? You have them estimated at 30% below Crow's figures." "Mr. Crow's figures assume the use of itinerant laborers," she explained, her tone level, professional. "My proposal is to offer the work to the Penwood tenants themselves, to be paid in winter when the fields are fallow. It provides them with income and gives them a stake in the land's recovery. Their productivity will be higher because it is their own land they are improving." He looked from the papers to her face. He was not speaking to his wife. He was speaking to a brilliant steward, a visionary. For the first time, he saw past the Duchess, past the quiet woman he had married for her lineage and ignored for her lack of dazzling charm, and saw the person. "Crow wants me to sell the land," he said. It was an admission of his own failure. "That would be a mistake," Eleonora stated, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of fact. "The underlying asset is strong. It has been mismanaged." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. He had mismanaged it. She did not need to say the words. "Why?" he asked, the question abrupt. "Why did you do all this?" She looked at him, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a hint of the deep, private pain she never showed. "It is an Ainsworth estate," she said simply. "My name is Ainsworth. The work needed to be done." It was not an accusation, but it landed like one. She had upheld the honor of a name he had treated as a license for his own selfishness. He had taken the title. She had taken the responsibility. He placed the portfolio on the table between them. "This plan," he said, his voice rough. "It will not work without capital. The bank has refused me." "They have refused you," she made a small, precise correction. "They have not seen the plan." He stared at her. The idea was so simple, so audacious. "Will you," he began, the words difficult, "will you present it with me, to the bankers?" She held his gaze. She could have refused. She could have pointed out the humiliation of his having to ask her, the woman he had so publicly scorned. But her victory was not in his humiliation. Her victory was in the work. "Yes," she said. A plain, unexpected yes. "I will." In the days that followed, the library became their world. A new routine established itself, replacing the cold distance with a quiet, focused collaboration. They worked late into the evenings, the large central table littered with maps, ledgers, and Eleanora's neat portfolios. The air, which had for years been thick with unspoken resentment, was now filled with the rustle of paper and the low murmur of their voices, discussing crop yields and interest rates. Alistair watched her. He learned the way she would bite her lip slightly when deep in a calculation, the way her brow would furrow as she traced a contour line on a map. He learned that her quietness was not emptiness, but concentration. He had spent 5 years in her presence and was only now beginning to see her. One evening, as the clock chimed midnight, he looked up to see her stifle a yawn. She was pale in the lamplight, the shadows under her eyes a testament to their long hours. Without a word, he rose, went to the chair by the hearth, and picked up the heavy wool shawl that was draped over it. He walked back to the table and gently laid it over her shoulders. She stilled, her head bowed over the ledger. She did not look up, but her hands, which had been moving across the page, came to rest. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was a small gesture, the kind a husband might make for his wife without a second thought. Between them, it felt momentous, a crack in the glacier that had separated them for years. Later that week, he found himself ordering a late supper to be brought to the library, a simple tray of soup and bread. They ate in companionable silence, the shared meal feeling more intimate than any of the grand, formal dinners they had endured in the past. Mrs. Davis, bringing in a fresh pot of coffee, observed the scene with a quiet, knowing expression. She saw the Duke pull Eleanora's chair out for her. She saw the way he now deferred to her judgment on any point related to the estate. She had witnessed the Duchess's long, lonely vigil, and now she was witnessing the beginning of the thaw. One afternoon, as they were reviewing the disastrous accounts of a previous steward from the 18th century, Eleanora let out a small, dry sound. Alistair looked up. "What is it?" "This steward," she said, a tiny smile playing on her lips, "invested £300 of the estate's money, a fortune then, in a scheme to extract silver from seawater." Alistair stared at her, then at the ledger she indicated. A slow smile spread across his own face. £300. With a projected return of 10,000%, she added, her voice laced with a dry wit he had never heard before. He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite sound he produced in drawing rooms. The sound echoed in the quiet library, surprising them both. Eleanora's smile widened. In that shared moment of amusement over a long-dead fool's folly, the distance between them shrank immeasurably. The work was not just about saving the estate anymore. It was about building something new, right here in the ruins of their marriage. The meeting at Baring's Bank took place on a grim, rainy November morning. Alistair felt a tension he hadn't experienced since his first military campaign. But as he glanced at Eleanora, seated beside him in the carriage, he was struck by her composure. She was wearing the same simple dark blue dress, her only adornment a small cameo brooch at her throat. She held her portfolio in her lap. She looked not like a duchess venturing into the alien world of finance, but like a general about to command a field she knew intimately. He, the Duke, was merely her escort. The bankers, a panel of 3 severe-looking men, were visibly surprised to see her. They greeted Alastair with a cold formality and looked at Eleonora with ill-disguised skepticism. Alastair made the introductions. "Gentlemen, this is my wife, the Duchess. The proposal we are here to present is her work." He then ceded the floor. He sat back, becoming a spectator. Eleonora did not begin with pleas or apologies. She opened her portfolio and began to speak. She walked them through the history of the Penwood estate, her command of the facts absolute. She explained the geological and agricultural reasons for its decline, using the old maps and surveys as evidence. Then, she laid out her restoration plan. She did not present it as a desperate hope, but as a sound, logical investment. She spoke their language. Capital outlay, amortization, return on investment, risk mitigation. The bankers, who had sat back with expressions of polite indulgence, began to lean forward. They started asking questions, sharp, technical questions. Eleonora answered each one without hesitation, often providing data they had not even thought to request. An hour passed. Alastair watched, fascinated. He was witnessing a masterclass in competence. The bankers were no longer speaking to a duke's wife. They were in a negotiation with an equal. Finally, the senior partner, a man named Sir John Gresham, held up a hand. "Your Grace," he said, looking at Eleonora, "this is the most thorough and compelling agricultural proposal I have seen in 20 years. He glanced at Alastair, then back to her. "You have anticipated every one of our concerns." He leaned back, tapping a pen on the table. "We will, of course, need to verify your data, but if your projections are even 80% accurate, this changes the conversation entirely." As they left the bank and stepped back into the rain-slicked London street, the sky felt a little brighter. Alastair held an umbrella over Eleonora's head as they waited for the carriage. "You were magnificent," he said, the words coming out with a sincerity that surprised him. She looked up at him, raindrops clinging to the brim of her bonnet. "I simply told them the truth," she said. He knew, in that moment, that he was in love with his wife. It was not a sudden, romantic revelation. It was a slow, dawning realization, built on a foundation of respect and awe. It was a love born not of beauty or charm, but of witnessing her mind, her integrity, her quiet, unshakable strength. And the knowledge of it was both a profound joy and a deep, aching pain. For he knew he had not earned the right to speak it. That evening, he sent a note to Isabella de Courcy's residence. It was brief and final. There was no anger in it, only a quiet finality. He was ending it not to appease Eleonora, but because he could no longer be the man who participated in such an arrangement. The performance was over. He had spent years acting the part of his father, the powerful duke with the beautiful mistress and the neglected wife. He had sworn he despised his parents' marriage, a cold tableau of public duty and private misery. Yet, he had replicated its worst aspects. He had used his father's sins as an excuse, a pattern to fall into. His wound, his childhood vow to never be trapped in a loveless marriage, had become the very policy that created one. Breaking with Isabella was not a solution. It was merely the first, necessary step in dismantling the false man he had been. The real work, the work of earning the respect of the woman in the library, had only just begun. A week later, a letter arrived from Barings. The loan was approved. Not only that, but they offered more favourable terms than Alastair had dared to hope for. They were not just extending credit, they were investing in Eleonora's plan. He took the letter not to his study, but to the estate office, where he knew she would be. He found her there, updating the very ledgers that had started it all. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it, her expression calm. A small, satisfied nod was her only reaction. "Good," she said. "We can begin breaking ground next week." He wanted to say more. He wanted to thank her, to tell her she had saved them. But the words felt hollow. Action was the only currency that had any value between them now. "I will ride out to Penwood tomorrow," he said, "to speak with the tenants myself, to tell them the work is beginning." She looked up at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. He had never taken a direct interest in the tenants before. "Will you come with me?" he asked. The question hung in the air. It was more than an invitation. It was a request for partnership, for a shared future that went beyond the walls of the library. She considered him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I will." The journey to Penwood was different this time. They shared a carriage, sitting opposite one another. The silence was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a space of quiet contemplation. When they arrived, the tenant farmers, led by John Miller, were gathered, their faces a mixture of hope and skepticism. Alistair stood before them, with Eleonora at his side. He did not speak like a lord from on high. He spoke of the new drainage, the new planting schedules. He used the words she had taught him. He told them it was a partnership. When he was finished, he did not dismiss them. He asked for their questions. For hours they walked the fields together, Alistair and Eleonora, listening to the men who worked the land. He listened with an attention he had never given them before, and he saw how they deferred to Eleonora, how they spoke to her with a respect born of her genuine understanding. He was not the hero of this story. He was a latecomer, a convert. As the winter sun began to set, casting long, golden rays across the sorrow field, they found themselves alone by the hedgerow where the old ditch lay hidden. The air was cold and clean. The ground beneath their feet felt solid, full of promise. He turned to her. The time for silence was over. "Eleonora," he began, his voice low and steady. "What you did at the ball, it was the most dignified thing I have ever witnessed. And it was a response to an indignity I inflicted. There is no excuse for my conduct. Not then, and not for the years before." He paused, forcing himself to meet her clear, unwavering gaze. "I misjudged you. Profoundly. I saw only what I expected to see, and I was blind to who you truly are. I am sorry." It was the delayed apology, stripped of all justification. It was a plain, honest admission of his failure. Eleonora listened, her expression giving nothing away. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back behind her ear. The apology was necessary, but the true amends had already been made in the shared work, in the quiet respect he had shown her over the past weeks. The words were a confirmation, not a revelation. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I accept your apology, Alistair." It was the first time she had used his given name in years. It landed in the quiet air between them like a seed falling on fertile ground. It did not promise a harvest, not yet, but for the first time, it promised the hope of spring. Winter settled over Ainsworth House. The social whirl of London felt a world away. The great house was quiet, inhabited not by a duke and his duchess, but by a man and a woman who were slowly, cautiously, learning to share a life. The work on the Penwood estate had begun, a project that now bound them together. One evening, Alistair found Eleonora in the library, curled in a chair by the fire, a book open in her lap. The room was warm, filled with the soft glow of firelight and the scent of old leather. He had been watching her for weeks, seeing the quiet contentment that settled on her features
when she was absorbed in her work or her reading. He had come to understand that her happiness was not a thing to be bestowed by him, but a state she cultivated herself. His role, if he were to have one, was simply to be a man worthy of sharing in it. He approached her quietly, a small, flat box in his hand. She looked up, her finger marking her place in the book. He held out the box. It was old, made of dark, worn velvet. It was not a grand jeweller's case. She took it, her expression questioning. She opened the lid. Inside, nestled on faded silk, was not a cascade of diamonds or a rope of gleaming rubies. It was a pair of pearl earrings. They were simple, lustrous, and elegant in their understatement. They were beautiful, but they were not a statement of wealth or power. "They were my mother's," Alistair said, his voice soft. "Not the ones she wore for portraits or state occasions. The ones she wore every day." He did not need to explain the symbolism. The Ainsworth diamonds were for the Duchess. These were for the woman. They were an offering not of status, but of intimacy, a private gesture, meant only for her. It was a request to be part of her ordinary life, not just the public one. Eleonora looked from the pearls to his face. She saw the hope there, and the fear. She saw the man who had worked alongside her, who had humbled himself, who had finally, truly, seen her. The past was not erased, but it no longer defined the present. She reached into the box and took out one of the earrings, her fingers steady. The pearl was smooth and cool against her skin. "Will you wear them?" he asked, the question holding the weight of everything unspoken between them. She looked at him, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips, reaching her eyes. It was a smile he had earned. "Yes," she said. "I will."